Welcome back to Fear Files, where the shadows whisper and the unknown lurks just beyond the light. Tonight, we delve into 3 chilling tales of terror. The eerie contents of a buried chest unleash a malevolent force upon an unsuspecting household. As renovations begin in a new home, dark rituals and a vengeful entity threaten to consume all who enter. Turn off the lights, lock your doors, and join us as we explore the terrifying unknown. This is Fear Files.
Jonathan Marsh drove the family wagon up the narrow, winding road, the wheels creaking under the weight of their belongings. Emily sat beside him, her eyes wide with anticipation as she cradled their youngest, Clara, in her arms. Samuel, their 8-year-old son, leaned out the back, trying to catch a glimpse of their new home. "There it is," Emily exclaimed, pointing ahead. The mansion loomed before them, its tall, dark silhouette stark against the evening sky. The house was a grand old Victorian with intricate woodwork and tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch their approach with silent malice. Jonathan pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mansion. "It's even more impressive up close," he said, though his voice held a note of unease. Samuel jumped down from the wagon, his excitement undimmed. "This place is huge. Can we explore, Dad?" "Let's get everything inside first," Jonathan replied. "Then we can look around." As they began unloading the wagon, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at the windows, half expecting to see a shadowy figure, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling the leaves of the nearby trees and the distant call of a night bird. Inside, the mansion was as grand as it was outside. High ceilings adorned with ornate moldings, hardwood floors that creaked underfoot, and large empty rooms that echoed with their footsteps. Despite the grandeur, the house felt cold and unwelcoming. Emily placed Clara in her crib and turned to Jonathan. "What do you think?" "It's got potential," Jonathan said, forcing a smile. "It'll take a lot of work, but we'll make it our own." Emily nodded. "I know you will. You're the best carpenter in the state." As they settled in for the night, the house remained eerily silent. Jonathan lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, wondering if they had made the right choice. The next morning, Jonathan set to work on the renovations. He started in the kitchen, planning to update the cabinets and counters. As he reached for his toolbox, he noticed something odd. The hammer he had left on the counter the night before was missing. "Emily, have you seen my hammer?" he called out. "No, I haven't touched it," she replied from the living room. Jonathan frowned and began searching. He found the hammer embedded in the wall as if it had been thrown with incredible force. He pulled it free, puzzled by how it had gotten there. "Strange," he muttered, but brushed it off. Old houses had their quirks. As the days passed, more tools went missing, only to reappear in impossible locations. A screwdriver was found inside a sealed cupboard. Nails were discovered floating in midair, and a saw blade was embedded in the ceiling. The occurrences were becoming harder to dismiss. One night, Jonathan was awoken by the sound of whispers. He sat up, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, a cacophony of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The walls began to shake, the plaster cracking and the floorboards vibrating. Emily sat up beside him, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Jonathan said, grabbing her hand. "But we're going to find out." Determined to uncover the truth, Jonathan and Emily began exploring the mansion. In the attic, they found an old trunk filled with dusty books and papers. Among them was a diary, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. Jonathan opened the diary, revealing the meticulous handwriting of Elias Blackwood. As they read, a chilling story unfolded. Blackwood had been an occultist, obsessed with summoning a powerful entity to grant him eternal life. He had performed dark rituals using the mansion's very foundation as a conduit for his magic. "The entity is bound to this house," Jonathan read aloud, "and it is enraged by our presence." Emily shivered. "What do we do?" "We need to find a way to banish it," Jonathan said, "before it destroys us." As they delved deeper into the diary, they found descriptions of the rituals Blackwood had performed, the sacrifices he had made, and the entity's growing power. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, written in shaky, frantic handwriting. "He must have realized too late what he had unleashed," Emily said. Jonathan nodded. "And now it's our problem." Jonathan decided to seek help from the townspeople. He visited the local library, hoping to find more information about Blackwood and the mansion's history. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Havisham, seemed reluctant to talk. "Why do you want to know about Blackwood?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "We're living in his old mansion," Jonathan explained, "and strange things have been happening." Mrs. Havisham sighed. "That place has always been trouble. Blackwood was a madman, obsessed with dark magic. He disappeared one night and no one ever saw him again." "Do you know anything about the rituals he performed?" Jonathan asked. The librarian hesitated, then nodded. "There are rumors. People say he tried to summon a demon, to bind it to the house. He thought he could control it, but he was wrong." Jonathan thanked her and returned home, more determined than ever to protect his family. He spent hours poring over the diary, searching for a way to banish the entity. The entity's attacks grew more violent. It threw furniture, shattered windows, and filled the house with deafening screams. Jonathan and Emily were on edge, their nerves frayed. One night, as they huddled together in the living room, the entity manifested. A dark, swirling form appeared in the center of the room, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "This house is mine." Jonathan stood his ground, clutching the diary. "We won't let you have it." The entity laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You have no idea what you are up against." The house began to shake, the walls cracking and the floorboards splintering. Jonathan and Emily held on to each other, determined to stand their ground. Jonathan found a passage in the diary that described a ritual to banish the entity. It required a powerful symbol, drawn in blood, and a series of incantations. It was dangerous, but it was their only hope. "We have to try," Jonathan said, his voice firm. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll do it together." They prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary materials and memorizing the incantations. As night fell, they drew the symbol on the floor of the attic, using their own blood as ink. The entity appeared, its form more solid and terrifying than ever. "You dare to challenge me?" it roared. Jonathan and Emily began the incantations, their voices steady and clear. The symbol glowed, the light growing brighter as they continued. The entity screamed in rage, its form twisting and writhing. "You cannot defeat me!" But Jonathan and Emily persisted, their love and determination giving them strength. The light grew blinding, and with a final, agonized scream, the entity was banished. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Jonathan and Emily collapsed, exhausted but victorious. The next morning, the mansion felt different. The air was lighter, the rooms brighter. The malevolent presence was gone, and the house was finally at peace. Jonathan and Emily stood in the living room holding hands. "We did it," Emily said, her voice filled with relief. "Yes, we did," Jonathan replied, "and now we can make this house a home." As they continued their renovations, the mansion transformed. The walls were repaired, the rooms filled with warmth and light. Jonathan's dream of restoring the old house had come true, and their family was safe. But deep in the attic, the old diary remained, a reminder of the darkness they had faced. Jonathan knew that they had been lucky and that some things were best left undisturbed. The mansion stood as a testament to their strength and love, a new chapter in its long and haunted history. And as they looked out over the countryside, Jonathan and Emily knew that they had found their home. Margaret Whitfield stood at the edge of the overgrown garden, gazing up at the imposing manor that would be their new home. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, and its tall, narrow windows seemed to watch her with silent anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the distant sound of birdsong was the only indication of life in the secluded estate. Her husband, Edward, approached, carrying a box of their belongings. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" he said, a note of excitement in his voice. Margaret nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest since they arrived. "It has potential," she replied, "a lot of history to uncover." Their children, Thomas and Lily, ran ahead, exploring the grounds with the boundless energy of youth. Thomas, the elder of the two at 12, called out, "Look, there's a pond back here." "Be careful," Margaret warned, but smiled at their enthusiasm. As they began unpacking, Margaret wandered into the parlor, her eyes drawn to a large, covered frame resting against the wall. Curious, she pulled the cloth away, revealing a portrait of a stern-looking man in early 19th century attire. His eyes seemed to follow her, and a shiver ran down her spine. "Who do you suppose this is?" Edward asked, joining her. "Perhaps a former owner," Margaret mused. "We'll need to look into it." That evening, as they sat down to dinner in the grand dining room, the house seemed to come alive with creaks and groans. Margaret told herself it was just the settling of an old building, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The next few days were a flurry of activity as the family settled in. Margaret dedicated her mornings to research, delving into the manor's history at the local library. The librarian, a stern woman named Mrs. Pritchard, was more than willing to help. "The manor has a rather dark history," Mrs. Pritchard said, handing Margaret a stack of old documents. "The Ravenscroft family were its longest occupants. Victor Ravenscroft, the painter, was the last of them." Margaret's interest piqued. Victor Ravenscroft? The portrait in the parlor must be his work. Mrs. Pritchard nodded. He was quite talented but troubled. He became obsessed with his final work and, well, he met a tragic end. As Margaret pored over the documents, she learned of Victor's descent into madness. His obsession with capturing the essence of his subjects had driven him to the brink, culminating in his suicide. The portrait in their parlor was rumored to be his last and most cursed creation. That night, Margaret awoke to the sound of whispers. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to come from the parlor, echoing through the halls. She slipped out of bed and made her way downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the portrait, the whispers grew louder. The man's eyes seemed to bore into her soul, his expression shifting from stern to sinister. Margaret backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Edward," she called, her voice trembling. "Edward, come here." Edward stumbled out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong?" Margaret pointed to the portrait. It's alive. I heard whispers." Edward frowned, moving closer to the painting. "It's just your imagination, Margaret. Old houses make strange noises." Margaret shook her head. "No, it's more than that. There's something wrong with this portrait." The following days were filled with inexplicable occurrences. Objects levitated and smashed against walls, and the whispers became a nightly torment. Thomas and Lily were plagued by vivid nightmares, waking up screaming in terror. Margaret's research led her to a local historian, Mr. Harding, who confirmed her worst fears. "The portrait is cursed," he said gravely. "Victor Ravenscroft's spirit is bound to it, driven mad by his own creation. He seeks vengeance and release." "How do we stop it?" Margaret asked, desperation in her voice. Mr. Harding sighed. "There may be a way to break the curse, but it is dangerous. You must confront the spirit and perform a ritual to sever its ties to the portrait." Margaret returned home, determined to protect her family. She explained the situation to Edward, who was skeptical but supportive. Together, they prepared for the confrontation, gathering the necessary materials for the ritual. As night fell, the atmosphere in the manor grew oppressive. The whispers were louder than ever, and the portrait seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Margaret and Edward stood before it, their hearts pounding. "Victor Ravenscroft," Margaret called out, her voice steady. "We know you are here. We demand that you show yourself." The air grew cold, and the portrait's eyes glowed with a malevolent light. A shadowy figure emerged, its form shifting and writhing. "You dare challenge me?" it hissed. Margaret held her ground. "We will not be driven from our home. We will break your curse." Margaret and Edward began the ritual, chanting the incantations Mr. Harding had given them. The air crackled with energy, and the shadowy figure writhed in agony. "You cannot defeat me," it roared, its voice echoing through the halls. Margaret's voice grew stronger. "By the power of light and love, we banish you from this place." The figure screamed, its form dissolving into wisps of darkness. The portrait's eyes dimmed, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Margaret and Edward collapsed, exhausted but victorious. The manor was finally at peace. In the days that followed, the family adjusted to their now peaceful home. Margaret continued her research, documenting the history of the manor and its former occupants. She felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had freed Victor Ravenscroft's tortured spirit. As the years passed, the Whitfield family thrived in their new home. The manor became a place of warmth and love, its dark history fading into the past. But Margaret never forgot the portrait and the terror it had brought. She kept it hidden away, a reminder of the power of obsession and the importance of letting go. Samuel Thornton stood at the edge of the garden, wiping sweat from his brow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the farmhouse, giving it an almost ethereal glow. He looked down at the chest his spade had struck, its surface worn and covered in strange symbols. "Eleanor, come see this," he called to his wife, who was tending to their children nearby. Eleanor approached, her eyes widening at the sight of the chest. "What do you suppose it is, Samuel?" "I'm not sure," he replied, kneeling to examine it closer. "But it looks old, very old." With some effort, they managed to pry the chest open, revealing a collection of eerie artifacts, a tarnished silver dagger, a collection of yellowed parchments covered in arcane symbols, and a small, intricately carved figurine. "These must be from the previous owners," Eleanor said, a note of unease in her voice. "Should we bring them inside?" Samuel hesitated but nodded. "Yes, I think we should. They might help us learn more about the house and its history." That night, as the family sat down to dinner, the air in the house grew noticeably colder. Samuel dismissed it as a draft, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After putting the children to bed, she joined Samuel in the parlor, where he was examining the artifacts. "These symbols are unlike anything I've ever seen," Samuel said, holding up one of the parchments. "They're not from any known language or culture." Eleanor shivered, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe we should put them back, Samuel. I have a bad feeling about this." "Nonsense," Samuel replied. were on the verge of a great discovery. The following days were marked by a series of inexplicable events. The temperature in the house remained unnaturally cold, and a sinister laughter echoed through the rooms at night. Objects moved on their own, and the children woke with mysterious bruises. "Eleanor, look at this," Samuel said one morning, showing her the bruises on Thomas's arms. "They're getting worse." "We need to do something, Samuel," Eleanor insisted. "This can't be a coincidence." Samuel agreed to consult with the local historian, Mr. Willoughby, who had extensive knowledge of the area's past. Mr. Willoughby listened intently as Samuel described the artifacts and the strange occurrences. "Those items you found are dangerous," Mr. Willoughby said gravely. "They belong to Elias Caldwell, a notorious occultist. He buried them to contain a powerful entity he summoned but could not control." "Is there a way to stop it?" Samuel asked, desperation in his voice. Mr. Willoughby sighed. "There might be a way, but it will be difficult and dangerous. You must return the artifacts to their original resting place and perform a ritual to seal the entity." Samuel returned home, determined to protect his family. He explained the situation to Eleanor, who was frightened but supportive. Together, they prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary materials and memorizing the incantations. As night fell, the atmosphere in the farmhouse grew oppressive. The sinister laughter grew louder, and the temperature dropped even further. Samuel and Eleanor stood in the garden, the artifacts laid out before them. "Are you ready?" Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Eleanor nodded. "We have to do this for the children." They began the ritual, chanting the incantations Mr. Willoughby had given them. The air crackled with energy, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and writhing. "You dare challenge me?" it hissed, its voice echoing through the night. Samuel held his ground. "By the power of light and love, we banish you from this place." The entity screamed, its form dissolving into wisps of darkness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Samuel and Eleanor collapsed, exhausted but victorious. The farmhouse was finally at peace. In the days that followed, the family adjusted to their now peaceful home. Samuel continued his research, documenting the history of the farmhouse and its former occupants. He felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had freed the entity's tortured spirit. As the years passed, the Thornton family thrived in their new home. The farmhouse became a place of warmth and love, its dark history fading into the past. But Samuel never forgot the artifacts and the terror they had brought. He kept them hidden away, a reminder of the power of obsession and the importance of letting go.
Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through Fear Files. We hope these tales of haunted portraits, cursed artifacts, and malevolent entities have sent shivers down your spine. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Share your thoughts and your own spooky experiences in the comments below. Until next time, remember, some secrets are best left buried, and not every shadow is empty. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep the lights on. Good night.